Hey everybody, I'm Anthony.
And I'm Jordan.
We're here with the Force Fable update for this week. As you may remember from last week, we said towards the end of the video that we're going to be discussing controllers and their basic functions, things like button mapping, the general layout of most controllers. So that's where we're going to kick it off today. And I think a good place to start off would be the Xbox 360 controller, since that's one of the more dominant controllers in the industry right now.
Mm-hmm.
So Jordan, you have a lot more FaceTime with Xbox than I do, since I use the Master Race. So why don't you go ahead and give the general layout of most games. I know you play racing games, so try to give the layout of those too.
Yep.
But also give the general layout of what most shooters, the button combos will use, and then I'll pick it up with the PlayStation.
Can do. All right. So, it's pretty widely agreed that the Xbox controller is damn good, save for the D-pad, which, kind of sucks. Anyways, so going over like the default layout, I mean, I'm sure most people who are watching this are really familiar with the Xbox controller, or at least enough to know, where the buttons are and everything. So, primarily, obviously, which is good across all controllers nowadays, are two control sticks, the left one and the right one. Now on the 360, these are offset, meaning that one is like near the top of the controller, and then the other one's near the bottom of the controller. If you're playing like PlayStation, they're on the same level, they're right next to each other. So basically, the two sticks, one is usually for movement, and the other is usually to control the camera, or to control like an alternate menu, or moving in a different direction. So for example, if you're walking around in a game like an adventure game or like a shooter, pushing the left stick will move your character. It'll move their body basically, and then moving the right stick will basically move their head or the camera, just depending on how you look at it. And sometimes the camera rotates around the character. If you're in third person, sometimes the camera literally like acts as your character turning their head if you're in first person, so that controls where you're looking, regardless. And then the left stick, pretty self-explanatory. Push it forward to move forward, push it back to move back, and etc. And then moving on from that, you got typically 4 face buttons. Now on the Xbox 360 controller, these are like A, B, X, and Y. PlayStation is triangle, square, circle, and X. And these are typically mapped to, various functions. Most games these days, A is always used for, in menus at least, like accept, and then B is used for back. So if you're in a menu, press A to, choose an option, press B to go back. But then when you're in game, A is usually something like jump. What else is A usually mapped to? I guess I'm kind
of... I've seen A used as jump. I've seen it used as activate. I've seen it used as like if you're doing and I'm using a Skyrim term here, but if you're doing some sort of radio quest or something like that,
yeah.
To where you don't need to be in a menu to accept something, a lot of times they'll put A as the accept, and in some cases, in some older 360 like RPG style games, A will be for a positive answer to some character's question, and B will be used for a negative answer.
Yeah. Good point. Oftentimes A is also used to sprint. In some games like Mass Effect comes to mind. So basically if you hold down A while moving with the left stick, your character will run faster, or they'll like move in an altered way. Next up we got B. Now A is usually, pretty much the same for every game, except for racing games where primarily you use the triggers and the control sticks, which we'll talk about later. But A is pretty much the same thing. But then you get to the other buttons, and these are all different across various genres. B, for example, in Halo is, at least it used to be melee, right? Or
yeah, and I think it still is.
Yeah, and obviously games have various control methods and everything. But B is pretty common for melee, also for crouching in games like Borderlands, one of my favorites. And then sometimes it's also for like using certain weapon types, but that's not as common. And then we'll just keep going around the circle, so we'll go to Y. And Y, most often, these days is used for switching weapons in first-person games. In racing games, it's sometimes used to like shift gears if you're using a manual transmission. It's also used to like swap items out in adventure games. So if you have like an inventory, you can have certain items mapped to each of the face buttons and things like that, or use like a certain ability. And then X is pretty similar to Y in that it can be pretty much anything, just depending on what the developers choose to do. But it's really common for X to be a button to activate something in-game, to pick up stuff, to reload if you're playing a shooter. That's basically, the extent of what X and Y do. But, they're not really restricted as much as A and B are. And then going to the top of the controller, basically like the last main element, you got the bumpers or the triggers. So the Xbox has 2 bumpers and 2 triggers, one on each side of the controller, or one of each on both sides of the controller. So the bumpers in these cases, so in shooters they're often used for like grenades or also for melee sometimes. Then you got the triggers. So again, very common with shooters. That's probably like the most common genre these days, at least some element of that. Right trigger is almost always shoot. Left trigger can be aiming.
That's usually most of what it's used for. Either it's for some way of readying whatever weapon style that you're using. Some RPG games will switch them up, or not switch them up, but they'll use one trigger to block.
Yeah.
I'm thinking specifically of Skyrim. Yeah, and then the bumpers, I actually wanted to note with some RPG games, the bumpers will actually be used to change out the little menus at the bottom that hold things like your multiple spells or the items that you've placed on the face buttons and things like that.
And then the triggers are also in racing games too, or any driving elements of a game. The triggers are really almost exclusively used there for the right one would be your gas, your accelerator, and then the left one would be brake or reverse. Now,
as far as the PlayStation controller is concerned, you pretty much covered the generalities of each. They don't really break from what Microsoft does. Microsoft doesn't break from what Sony does.
Yeah.
They try to keep them. Basically, the only difference is the aesthetics and specifically ergonomics. Yeah, and the names of the buttons. But even them, like even the names are closely related. But as far as ergonomics go, I do want to point out that the reason why, at least what I believe, the reason why Microsoft went with a slightly more ergonomic feel to the controller is that if you were to pretend to hold a controller in front of you, a regular Xbox controller or PS3 controller or whatever, your thumbs don't naturally go parallel to each other. They naturally fit forward, which is what Microsoft intended, to allow the general gamer to just be able to rest their thumbs on the most used aspects of the controller. And the PlayStation forces you to parallel, pushing your thumbs parallel to each other. And it may sound like I'm a little biased to this, and I kind of am. Not a big fan of the PlayStation controller, although I do understand you're not having to press so far down because the buttons are so big, because they're not. But one thing I wanted to do, since you went over the specifics, I actually wanted to go over the general layout and what to expect certain buttons to be. So if you take a look at any controller at all, and let's go with the right side of the controller first, and you take those buttons, we'll go with the right side of the controller from the stick all the way over. You take a look at those. 9 times out of 10, those are going to be your interaction buttons.
Yep.
Okay, those are going to be where you set your sights, where you set your camera angle, where you pick something up, accept something, where you fire your gun, where you actually throw a legitimate grenade, not like a flashbang or a smoke grenade or something like that. So you're going to be throwing or utilizing some sort of special move. You're going to be firing your weapon, activating something, accepting something, or canceling out of a menu, something like that. Yeah. The right side of the controller, 9 times out of 10, is your interaction side.
See, I never even thought about that, but it makes perfect sense, seeing as how, most people are right-handed. They're going to be more, dexterity in their right hand.
Be it a keyboard and mouse, be it an Xbox, PlayStation, Sometimes even just the Wiimote is where a lot of your interaction comes from, because you have to point at the screen, you have to select what you're going to, do whatever.
I think the Wiimote is a really just explicit example of that too, because I mean, obviously you can switch hands with that really easily, but if you look at whichever hand you put the remote in, that's loaded with controls compared to the nunchuck, which basically has 3. It has a stick and 2 buttons. Yep. And it's like that really, brings it into perspective, like just how different the two sides, so to speak, of the controller are.
Yep. And see, where a lot of people have the confusion then comes in with the left side of the controller and being able to juggle between the two. Mm-hmm. The left side of the controller, your left hand, is going to be almost entirely movement and inventory.
Yeah.
Whatever game you're playing, that entire left side is going to be your movement, and it's going to be your inventory selection or use. Mm-hmm. If you're looking at first-person shooter, that left side is going to bring the sights up. It's going to bring your extra, your flashbangs, your smoke grenades, something like that, that left bumper. The stick on the left side is going to move you forward, back. You're going to strafe left and right. And then you've got that D-pad for your inventory or other special items selection and activation. So just to kind of recap, the entire right side is 9 times out of 10 for interaction and actual visual placement, and the entire left side is usually for movement and inventory usage. And this kind of goes in even with your description of the racing games. A lot of interaction with the actual vehicle comes from the right side, whereas physical and all-out movement, turning, stopping, that kind of stuff, comes from the left side of the controller. Now, it is pertinent to mention that a lot of games nowadays allow you to change the button configuration, or the button mapping is what we call it, of whatever controller you're using. A lot of times it'll be presets. You can choose from different presets. Really? Or some games actually allow you to choose this button does this, this button does this, and so on.
Now, a really good example of those presets is Borderlands, where it actually includes common presets. So, like, Call of Duty has one control layout, Halo has another, Left 4 Dead has yet another, Borderlands has its own. And I liked how they did it. They actually gave them creative names. Like, the one for Halo isn't just named Halo layout; it's named Big Green Marine or something like that, and it's a call to obviously their main character, Master Chief. And it's a similar thing with Left 4 Dead. It was Zombie Killer and things like that. And then obviously the prime example of just all-out customization is on the PC, where you can do complete key binding changes if you want to in most games.
All right, guys, that's going to be it for Jordan and I. Appreciate you stopping by and taking a listen. Next week we're going to talk about whatever the hell we want to talk about. So go ahead and tune in next week to figure out what that is.
Yeah.
That's how that works, because we're the boss.